The man arrived at the edge of Alice Archer's Valley on a Tuesday in late October of 1873, half frozen and bleeding from a gash above his left brow, and when she saw him swaying in his saddle from the window of her kitchen, her first instinct was not fear but something far more complicated than that. She had been living alone on the 40 acres since August, since the fever took her husband Thomas and left her with a half-finished farmhouse, a barn that needed new boards along the eastern wall, 2 milk cows, a mule named Calhoun, and a winter that was already sharpening its teeth out across the Colorado high country. The nearest town was Ridgecrest, a raw little settlement of perhaps 200 souls sitting some 11 miles east along a road that turned to mud every time the sky opened up, which in October it did with considerable frequency. Her nearest neighbor was a widow woman named Della Patterson, who lived 4 miles to the north and who had her own troubles enough without taking on Alice's. So Alice Archer had learned, in those 2.5 months since she buried Thomas beneath the elm tree at the southern edge of the property, to be very careful about what startled her and what did not. A rider appearing at dusk in the gray October rain was not, by itself, cause for alarm. A rider who was barely staying upright in his saddle was something else entirely. She set down the iron pot she had been holding and wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. He had stopped his horse at the fence line, some 30 yards from the house, and he was just sitting there in the rain. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long canvas duster that had seen better years. His hat was soaked through. The horse beneath him was a dark bay, road-weary and hip-shot, with the look of an animal that had been pushed hard over a long distance. Alice stepped onto the porch and called out to him, "You need help, mister." The man lifted his head, and even from 30 yards she could see the dark smear of dried blood on the side of his face. "Ma'am," he said. His voice carried fine through the rain, a low, steady kind of voice. "I hate to impose. I was looking for somewhere to get out of the weather, just me and my horse. Your barn would be a kindness if you can spare it." Alice studied him for a moment. She was 28 years old and she was not naive about the world. She had grown up in Kansas, and she had come west with Thomas, and she knew that not every man who looked exhausted and harmless actually was. But she also knew that the temperature was dropping fast and that the man had blood on his face, and that turning a hurt man away into a Colorado night in late October was something she was not capable of doing, regardless of what Thomas might have said about the wisdom of it. "Ride around to the left," she called back. "Barn doors on the south side. I'll be along directly." She went back inside and got the old Navy Colt from the shelf above the fireplace, the one Thomas had kept loaded since they arrived, and she tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Then she put her coat on and went out to the barn. The man was already inside when she got there, and he had managed to unsaddle the bay and was rubbing the animal down with a handful of dry straw in the slow, methodical way of someone who takes care of his horse before he takes care of himself. He had hung the saddle over the top rail of the nearest stall without being told where to put it, which told Alice something about him. He heard her come in and turned around. He was younger than she had first thought, probably around 30, maybe a year or two on either side. His face was lean and square-jawed, and would have been handsome if it had not been so exhausted. The cut above his brow was not as bad as the blood had made it look, but it was ragged and it needed cleaning. "Peter Ramsey," he said. He did not offer his hand because his were dirty from the road, and she appreciated that small piece of consideration. "Alice Archer," she said. She made sure he could see that her hand was near her apron pocket, not inside it, but near it. "What happened to your head?" "Rock slide," he said. "Up on the pass north of here. Nothing serious." "It looks serious enough." "Come up to the house when you've finished with your horse. I'll clean it." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to do that, ma'am." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm offering." "There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There is." She left him to finish with the horse and went back to the house and put a pot of water on to heat and got out the clean rags she kept for doctoring and the small bottle of carbolic she had been hoarding since the spring. She also did not put the Navy Colt back on the shelf. She left it on the table, within reach but not pointed at anything. Peter Ramsey knocked on her door 10 minutes later and came inside when she told him to, and he took off his hat and stood just inside the door and looked at the room with the careful, taking-in look of a man who had spent a long time in open country and was adjusting to walls. "Sit down," Alice said, nodding at the chair nearest the fire. "Take your coat off." He did both things without argument, which she also appreciated. She had known men who could not accept help without making it difficult, who turned every small kindness into a negotiation. She cleaned the cut above his brow with carbolic and warm water, and she was close enough to him while she did it to smell the rain in his hair and the road dust beneath it, and she was aware in a distant, not yet examined way that she had not been this close to another person in 2.5 months. He sat very still while she worked. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "Wyoming Territory," he said. "Working my way south for the winter." "Working your way to where?" "Wasn't sure yet," he said. "Somewhere warmer." She pressed a clean rag against the cut and held it there. "You'll want to keep this clean," she said. "Change the dressing tomorrow and the day after. It should close up in a week if you don't aggravate it." "I'll do that," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Archer." She noticed he had caught the absence of a Mr. in the house. Men notice things like that, especially careful men, and she thought he was a careful man. "My husband passed in August," she said matter-of-factly. "Fever." "I'm sorry," he said, and it did not sound like a polite thing to say. It sounded like he meant it. She stepped back and looked at the cut critically. It was clean now, and she put a strip of cloth against it and told him to hold it there. "There's soup on the fire," she said. "You'll eat before you go back out." "Mrs. Archer, you don't need to, Mr. Ramsey," she said, and she heard the edge of Thomas's practicality in her own voice. "It is cold and it is raining and you have a cut on your head and that soup is already made. Sit down and eat it." He sat down and ate it. They did not talk much during the meal, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Alice was surprised by that. She had been braced for the awkwardness of a stranger in the house, and instead she found something that felt almost ordinary, almost like the evenings she had shared with Thomas at this same table before. After the soup, Peter Ramsey set his bowl down and looked across the table at her. "You said your husband built this place." "We built it together," Alice said. "Started in the spring, he never got to finish it." She looked at the wall behind him, at the bare wood where the plaster had never gone on. "There's still a good deal that needs doing before it's what it ought to be." "I can see that," he said, not unkindly, just observational. "The barn needs boards on the east wall," she said, almost to herself, making her mental inventory the way she did every evening. "The root cellar door won't sit right. The fence along the south field has been going down in sections since the first frost." She stopped. She had not meant to say any of that out loud. Peter Ramsey did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at his hands, which were large and capable-looking, with the kind of permanent roughness that came from years of outdoor work. "I'm a fair hand with wood," he said finally, "and with fence." Alice looked at him. "I'm not looking for charity," she said carefully. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering work, if you've got it, in exchange for the use of your barn until the weather breaks." Alice was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady drum against the roof. She thought about Della Patterson, 4 miles north, who had told her just last week in no uncertain terms that a woman alone could not get a place through winter without help, and that pride was a fine quality in the spring but a dangerous one in January. She thought about the east wall of the barn, where the wind was already coming through the gaps well enough to flutter the hay. She thought about the fence sections down in the south field, which meant the cows could wander, which meant real trouble. "All right," Alice said, "but I want to be clear about the arrangement. You sleep in the barn, you take your meals here. You work for your keep, and when the weather settles and the road is passable, you move on." Peter Ramsey looked at her with something in his dark eyes that might have been relief and might have been respect and might have been something else she was not ready to look at directly. "That's fair," he said. "Good," Alice said. "There are blankets in the chest in the barn, left side when you go in. Help yourself." He thanked her, put on his hat and coat, and walked back out into the rain. Alice sat at the table for a while after he left, listening to the rain on the roof and not thinking anything in particular, or telling herself she wasn't. He was still there in the morning. She had half expected, in the honest part of herself that she rarely showed anyone, that she would wake up and find the bay horse gone, and the barn empty and Peter Ramsey, nothing more than a story she might tell Della Patterson. Instead, she woke to the sound of hammer blows coming from the east side of the barn, steady and purposeful in the gray morning light, and she stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and watched the dark shape of him moving against the barn wall, fitting new boards against the old frame with a care that said he was doing the job right instead of just doing it fast. She took him coffee at 7:30. He was on his knees fitting the bottom board when she came around the corner, and he looked up and accepted the cup with both hands, which she noticed. "There are more boards in the shed behind the barn," she said. "Found them," he said. "I'll use what's there and cut what I need from the timber stack." He looked along the wall, measuring with his eye. "This wall's been going for a while. Whoever built the original structure did good work on the framing, but the boards they used on this side weren't seasoned long enough." "Thomas worked fast," Alice said. "We were trying to have it done before cold weather." Peter nodded. "I can have this wall tight in 2 days," he said. "After that, the fence." "After the fence, the root cellar door," she said. He nodded and drank his coffee and handed her back the cup, and Alice walked back to the house to begin her own day's work. The rhythm of it settled in on them so naturally that she could not, afterward, have said exactly when it stopped feeling strange and started feeling simply like the way things were. He worked from first light to the point where the light failed him, and he worked well. He did not need to be told what to do, and he did not cut corners, and when he ran into something he was uncertain about he came to her and asked rather than guessing. She respected that. In the evenings he came to the house for supper, and they ate together at the kitchen table, and gradually the silences between them filled in with conversation the way a river fills in its banks after a rain, not all at once but steadily and without drama. She learned that Peter Ramsey was 31 years old, from a small town in Missouri that he had left at the age of 17. He had spent the better part of 14 years doing what a great many men of his generation and situation had done, working cattle drives north out of Texas, riding for various outfits in Wyoming and Montana, with a year spent at a timber operation in Oregon that he did not seem to want to talk about at length, and 1 year he mentioned only obliquely as having been in the service, which given the math she worked out meant he had been very young when he went. "Were you at the end of the war?" she asked one evening. She was mending one of her heavy winter shirts, and he was sitting across from her with a piece of her harness that needed stitching, which he had simply picked up from the pile in the corner and gone to work on without being asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The last 8 months of it," he said. "I was 16 when I went and 17 when I came back, and I don't recommend it to anyone." Alice looked at him. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you would." She had lost her older brother at Chickamauga, and her father had come home from Virginia with a limp he kept for the rest of his life, and a distance behind his eyes that never fully went away. She did not say any of this to Peter. Instead she said, "My brother didn't come back," and he looked at her with the quiet recognition of someone who understood exactly what that meant, and they went back to their work, and the fire burned down another inch. She also learned that he had never been married. He said this without defensiveness or apology, simply as a fact, the way he stated most things. "Never in one place long enough?" she asked. "Partly," he said. "Partly I just never met anyone who made me want to be." Alice looked at her mending and said nothing. "I'm sorry," he said. "That probably sounds like a peculiar thing to say." "It sounds like an honest thing to say," she said. He smiled at that. She had not seen him smile much in the first several days, but when he did it changed his whole face, turned it from something merely serious into something that she found herself wanting to look at. She turned her attention firmly back to her mending. The east wall of the barn was finished by the end of the second day, tight and solid and better than the original had been. The new boards fitted snug, and the cracks sealed against the wind. When Alice went to look at it that evening, running her palm along the new wood, she felt the absence of the draft that had been there all through October, and the sense of something taken care of properly was almost physical in its satisfaction. "It's good work," she told him. "It'll hold," he said, which she was already coming to understand was his way of saying the same thing. The fence took 4 days because there were more sections down than she had realized, and also because they had the first real snow of the season on the 3rd day, 6 inches that came down steady and quiet through the afternoon and left the valley looking new and clean and impossibly peaceful. Peter worked through it with his hat brim pulled down and his coat collar up, and Alice brought him hot coffee at midday and stood in the field with him while he drank it, and they both looked at the snow on the mountains to the north that were now fully white from their peaks halfway down their flanks. "Beautiful country," he said. "It is," Alice agreed. "Thomas always said this valley was the best thing he ever found." "He was right," Peter said. He handed her back the empty cup. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Archer." "Alice," she said, without particularly planning to. "You might as well call me Alice." He looked at her. "Peter," he said. "Then." They stood there for just a moment in the cold and the silence of the snow-covered valley, and then Alice said she had baking to do and walked back to the house, and she did not look back, though she was aware that he watched her go. On the 5th day, while Peter was working on the root cellar door, fitting it properly to its frame so it would sit level and latch clean, Della Patterson drove her buckboard up the road from the north and pulled in at the fence line and called out for Alice. Alice came out to meet her, and Della climbed down from the buckboard with the lively energy she brought to everything she did. She was 52 years old, a compact, vigorous woman with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that never missed a thing, and the first thing those eyes did was go to the figure crouched at the root cellar door with a hand plain. "Who is that?" Della said, not lowering her voice. "Hired hand," Alice said. "Peter Ramsey. He came through last Tuesday looking for shelter, and I offered him the barn in exchange for some work." Della's eyebrows went up. "Did you now?" "Don't make something out of it that it isn't," Alice said. "I am not making anything out of anything," Della said, but she was watching Peter with an expression of frank assessment. "He does good work. Very good work." "What does he look like under that hat?" "Della Patterson." "I am asking a practical question," Della said serenely. "I'm a widow woman myself, and I take an interest in the general welfare of— His name is Peter Ramsey, and he is from Missouri, and he is a good hand, and he is sleeping in the barn, and that is all there is to say about it," Alice said. Della smiled in a way that suggested she found a great deal more to say about it, but was choosing, for now, to hold her peace. She had brought Alice a wheel of cheese and a crock of preserved plums from her own pantry, and they went inside and had coffee, and when Peter came to the door a half-hour later to let Alice know the root cellar door was finished, he took off his hat and nodded politely to Della and said he hoped he wasn't interrupting. "Not at all," Della said, with the radiant social confidence of a woman in complete command of every room she has ever entered. "I was just getting acquainted with your employer." "She's not exactly my employer," Peter said, with the slight wariness of a man who senses a trap but cannot quite see where it's set. "What would you call it then?" Della asked pleasantly. "An arrangement," he said. Della looked at Alice with an expression of enormous satisfaction, as though this single word had confirmed everything she had previously suspected. After Della left, Alice stood at the window and watched her buckboard disappear up the north road and tried very hard not to smile. November came in with a cold that was serious and unambiguous. The temperatures dropped well below freezing most nights, and the snow that had fallen in late October hardened and stayed instead of melting, and the world outside the valley took on that particular remote quality of a Colorado winter settling in for the long run. The road to Ridgecrest became unreliable, passable on some days and not on others, and Alice began in earnest the work of getting the house through to spring. Peter had finished the most urgent repairs by the middle of the first week of November, and on the evening after he completed the last fence section, they sat at supper, and she waited for him to say that he would be moving on now that the work was done. He did not say it. Instead he said, "The porch rail on the north side is rotted through. If someone leans on it, it'll give way." Alice looked at him. "The door on the tack room doesn't hang right," he continued, "and you've got shingles loose on the south slope of the roof. I noticed them when the snow slid off last week." "Those things can wait until spring," Alice said carefully. "The shingles can't," he said. "If water gets under them and we get a hard freeze, it'll ruin the roof boards." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to stay," she said. "You've more than paid for the week in the barn." He looked at her directly. He had clear, dark eyes, and they were very honest when he looked at you, she had come to realize. Peter Ramsey did not look at people sideways. He looked straight at them, and it was both disconcerting and, she was discovering, something she found herself relying on. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm offering to, if you'll have me." He paused. "There's a lot of work here, and you can't do it alone, and winter is coming fast. I'm a capable man, and I have nowhere else I need to be." Alice thought about the leaking roof. She thought about the porch rail that would give way if she or someone else leaned on it in the dark. She thought about the long, cold months stretching out between her and spring, and she thought about how much easier it had been, these past 10 days, to face the end of each day knowing that there was another person in the barn across the yard, that she was not entirely alone in this valley. "All right," she said. "Stay through the winter." Something eased in his expression, something she had not known was tense until it relaxed. "I'll fix the shingles tomorrow," he said. "While the weather holds," she nodded. "I'll make extra cornbread," she said, and he smiled. He fixed the shingles the next day, working from the roof in weather that could not have been pleasant, and he fixed the porch rail the day after. And then he went through the house systematically. The way she was learning, he did everything, quietly and methodically, looking at each thing not as a separate job but as part of the whole, the way a good rancher looks at land. He showed her one afternoon where the cold was coming into the house along the base of the north wall, sitting down on the floor with a candle to show her the draft. "You need more chinking here," he said, "and the window frames need resetting. That's winter work, something to do when it's too cold to work outside." "Can you do that?" Alice asked. She was crouched beside him, close enough to see the candlelight on the line of his jaw. "I can," he said. "You'll need to help me. It's a two-person job, holding the frame while I set the wedges." "All right," she said. It was a two-person job, and they did it on a gray afternoon in mid-November when the wind outside was making the kind of sound that said there was weather coming. And they worked through the kitchen windows first, and then the sitting room window. And Alice held the frames while Peter tapped the wedges into place with precise, careful strokes, and they were close together for much of it in the way that work sometimes requires. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him and the steadiness of his hands and the smell of sawdust and cold air that seemed to follow him everywhere. She thought of Thomas. She thought of Thomas often, at unexpected moments. She thought of the way he had laughed, which had been freely and loudly, and with his whole body. She thought of how he had been the one who wanted to come west, who had a vision of this valley and what it could be, and how she had followed him because he was Thomas and she loved him, and because the west was wide and the east was getting crowded and full of the kind of grief that accumulates in a family after a war. She had been happy with Thomas. Not perfectly or without argument, because they were both strong-willed people who wanted the right things in slightly different ways, but genuinely and solidly happy. His death had not been a tragedy in the way that her brother's death had been a tragedy, because Thomas had been 36 and he had lived a full life and had not been robbed by anything except a fever that came and went like weather. But it was a loss as real and heavy as any she had known, and she carried it in her chest like a stone she had got used to but could not put down. She did not think that what she felt when she was close to Peter Ramsey was anything like what she had felt when she was close to Thomas. It was different in texture and quality. It was newer and less comfortable and more uncertain. But it was there, whatever it was, and she was honest enough with herself to know she could not simply look away from it and pretend it didn't exist. She thought it was probably nothing. She thought it was loneliness, which could masquerade very convincingly as other things. She thought with some firmness that she was going to be sensible about this. She was not entirely successful at being sensible, but she kept a good distance between her sensible and her not sensible parts, and the days went on. In the evenings, after supper, Peter sometimes read from the small collection of books on Alice's shelf, the Bible and a volume of Dickens, and a book about the flora of the Western Territories that had been Thomas's particular favorite. He read slowly and with attention, and Alice would look up from her sewing to see him turning a page with care, and something about the domestic ordinariness of it undid her a little each time. One evening she found him examining the unfinished wall at the back of the main room, the one where Thomas had run out of time, where the framing was done but no boards had gone on and the insulating was incomplete. "This is the room he was finishing last?" Peter asked. "The parlor," Alice said. "He had all the lumber for it, had it stacked and seasoned since June. He just ran out of summer." Peter put his hand on the bare framing and looked at it thoughtfully. "I could finish it," he said. He turned to look at her. "I know that's more than we agreed to, but the lumber's right there, and I know how he laid out the framing, and it would make this house tight for winter and right going into spring." He paused. "I think he would have wanted it finished." Alice stood very still in the doorway. "You don't know what he would have wanted," she said, but she said it gently, without heat. "No," Peter said. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." He took his hand off the framing. "But the offer stands, whenever you want." She stood there a moment longer. "When the weather is too cold for outside work," she said finally. "We'll do the parlor then." He nodded. They both looked at the unfinished wall for a moment, at the space where the room was supposed to be, and then Alice said she was going to put the kettle on for tea and went to the kitchen. December arrived with the full force of a Colorado winter, which was different from winter in the places either of them had come from. It was not just cold. It was a deep, penetrating, absolute cold that settled into everything and demanded respect. The mornings were still and white, and so clear that the mountains to the north seemed close enough to touch. The nights were starry and brutal. The road to Ridgecrest became impassable for days at a stretch, and the valley closed in on itself, the way a valley does in winter, becoming a world unto itself with its own rhythms and its own small events. Peter got the outside work finished before the worst of it set in. The porch, the outbuildings, the water trough that needed a new board, the door on the chicken house that would not latch. He worked steadily and without complaint even when the cold was serious, and when the weather finally drove him inside for good he came to Alice and said he was ready to start on the parlor whenever she gave the word. They started on the parlor on the 3rd day of December, a Sunday, which felt to Alice like a proper kind of day for it. She did not examine why. It took 12 days of inside work, spread across mornings and afternoons around the other necessities of the season. Peter worked with the care and thoroughness he brought to everything, and Alice worked beside him as the job required, steadying boards and passing tools, and, on one notable afternoon, holding a long section of trim while he nailed it into place from a stepladder, which meant she was standing close under him with her arms raised and her face tipped up, and he was looking down at her as he worked. And there was a moment that stretched itself out several seconds longer than it needed to, in which neither of them said anything at all. Then he finished the nail and said, "Good, thank you," and she lowered her arms and stepped back, and they went on with the work. On the evening of December 14th, they hung the last board of the parlor wall, and Alice stood in the middle of the room and looked around at what they had done, at the whole finished, proper room, and she felt the stone in her chest shift and settle differently, not gone but different, carrying its weight from a different angle. Thomas would have been pleased, she said. She felt Peter beside her, looking at the room. "It's a good room," he said. "It is," she said. "It's the room he imagined." She was quiet for a moment. He talked about it all the way from Kansas, what the house was going to look like. How we would have a proper parlor where we could have people to visit and a real kitchen and a garden in the spring. She stopped. He had a lot of plans. He built a good foundation for them, Peter said quietly. Alice turned to look at him. He was looking at the room, at the boards they had spent 12 days fitting and finishing, and his expression was serious in the particular way it got when he was feeling something he was not sure how to say. "Peter," she said. He looked at her. She had not planned what came next. She was not sure afterward that she had planned it at all, or whether it had simply been the accumulated weight of 2 months of shared work and shared meals and shared evenings and the December cold and the finished room and the feeling that had been building itself in her chest without her permission. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the room, for all of it, for staying." He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight was warm in the new room, throwing soft shadows along the finished boards. "I didn't stay out of obligation," he said. His voice was careful and honest and quiet. "I want you to know that." Alice felt her heart do something that she had not given it permission to do. "I know," she said. They stood there in the new room in the candlelight, and the distance between them, which had been maintained with some care for 2 months, was not so carefully maintained in that moment, and Peter Ramsey reached out very slowly and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and rough with work, and Alice's hand fit inside it in a way that felt like something she had not known she was missing until the moment it was there. She did not pull away. They stood like that for what might have been a long time or a short one. It was difficult to say. And then Alice said softly that she should get supper on, and he let go of her hand, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood at the stove for several minutes doing nothing at all with her hands, which were still warm from his. Peter Ramsey did not sleep in the barn that night and feel differently in the morning. He was not a man who moved quickly, except in situations that required it. He went back to the barn and went to sleep, and in the morning he came to breakfast the same as he always did, and they worked through the day the same as always. But something had changed in the texture of the silence between them, the way a piece of music changes when a note is added that was always supposed to be there. Christmas came. It was the quietest Christmas Alice had known since childhood, and also, she thought, one of the best. Della Patterson drove down from the north with a basket of things and spent the afternoon with them, and she looked at Peter with the frank and knowing expression she had been wearing since November and made no comment about anything except to say that the parlor was beautifully done and that she hoped Alice appreciated the quality of workmanship. Peter cooked the venison. He was a better cook than he had initially admitted, and the meal was good, and they ate it in the new parlor by the fire. And Della told stories about her first winter in Colorado that made both of them laugh until the tears came. And when Della drove back north in the early evening dark, waving from the buckboard with tremendous satisfaction, Peter and Alice washed the dishes together and did not talk much and were not uncomfortable. "She approves of you," Alice said. "I got that impression," Peter said. "Della does not approve of everyone," Alice said. "Her opinion carries weight." He looked at her sideways with something in his expression that was warm and slightly amused. "Is that what I should be worried about?" he said. "Della Patterson's opinion." Alice felt the warmth in her face that was becoming familiar when he looked at her like that. "I didn't say worried," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." They put away the dishes and Alice made coffee, and they sat in the parlor that she now thought of as theirs, though she had not said so to anyone, and the fire was good and the room was warm and the night outside was the particular hard blue-black of a clear Colorado winter night. "I need to tell you something," Peter said. Alice set down her cup. "I left Wyoming because things went wrong at the outfit I was working for," he said. The owner of the place, a man named Harold Birch, was running cattle on land that didn't belong to him, federal grazing land and some homestead property that belonged to a family he'd pushed out the year before. He paused. "I found out about it and I told him what I thought of it, and he told me to collect my pay and get off his land. That's what I was doing, riding south, trying to get clear of it. Alice listened. I want you to know that in case it ever comes back around, he said. Birch has money and connections, and I made an enemy of him. I don't think it'll follow me to Colorado, but I want to be straight with you. Alice looked at him for a moment. You walked away from your livelihood because a man was taking land that wasn't his, she said. I couldn't stay after I knew about it, he said simply. What happened to the family, she asked. The Homestead family. Peter was quiet for a moment. A Shoshone family, he said. They'd had that land for 3 years, built on it, farmed it. Birch had people run them off in a single night. His jaw tightened. They went to the Indian Agency and got nothing but paper shuffling. I reported what I knew to the land office in Cheyenne and got told the matter was under review, which means nothing is going to happen. He looked at the fire. I'm not proud of how little I was able to do. Alice thought about this for a moment. The dispossession of native families from their land was not a story she had not heard before. It was woven through the whole history of the Western expansion, the whole complicated, often ugly business of what it meant to settle a place that was already occupied. She had her own feelings about it, formed partly by her father, who had been a just man and deeply uncomfortable with the direction of things even as he participated in them, and partly by her own eyes, which were good eyes that saw what they looked at. You did what you could do, she said. I believe that. He looked at her. I'm not a man who does things partway, he said. No, she said. I know that. The fire settled. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. Why are you telling me this now, she asked. He looked at her steadily. Because I think it matters that you know who I am, he said. Before things go any further. Alice was very still. And what do you think things are going to do, she asked, keeping her voice even. I think that depends on you, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was warm, and the room that they had built together was quiet around them, and Peter Ramsey was looking at her with those honest dark eyes that never looked at anything sideways. I am not a woman who does things carelessly, she said, or quickly. No, he said. I know that. I need you to know that whatever happens, she said, I am not looking to replace Thomas. He was his own person and his own story, and I loved him fully. I know that too, Peter said, and I'm not asking to replace anyone. What are you asking, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking to be allowed to be here, he said. However that looks, whatever form it takes, I'm asking not to be sent away. He paused. I find that I don't want to leave this valley. Alice felt the stone in her chest do that shifting thing again, making room for something. I'm not sending you away, she said. He nodded, slow and careful. All right, he said. Then I'll stay. January was cold enough to keep them close to the house and the barn. And in that proximity, they learned each other in the patient, detailed way that people learn each other, when there is nowhere else to go and nothing to perform for. Peter learned that Alice was fiercely capable in ways she underplayed and deeply funny in ways she surprised you with, and that she could be quiet for half a day and come out of it as though she had traveled somewhere and come back with something. Alice learned that Peter had a vein of deep feeling that ran under his surface practicality like water under stone, and that it surfaced in small ways, in the care he took with things, in the way he listened when she talked, in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. She caught him at it one morning, looking up suddenly from her butter churning to find him watching her from across the kitchen, with an expression so unguarded that they were both briefly startled into silence. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said, and went back to the churning, and he went back to repairing the harness he was working on. But the room felt different after that, warmer without the fire having changed at all. He kissed her for the first time on a Friday in late January, on the porch in the morning when it was so cold that their breath made clouds between them. She had stepped out to check the condition of the water trough and had found him already there, refilling it with fresh water hauled up from the well, and he had straightened up when he heard the door and looked at her with the snow on his shoulders and his face red from the cold and something in his eyes that he did not bother to hide anymore. She stepped down from the porch and walked to him, and he met her halfway, and it was brief and cold, and his mouth was warm against hers, and when she stepped back they were both very still for a moment. "I've been wanting to do that since November," he said. "I know," she said. "How long have you known?" "Since November," she said. He laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she laughed too, and they stood in the cold morning in the snow with their breath in clouds around them and laughed together, and it felt like something opening, like a door that had been latched finally coming open in a good wind. They were careful after that, both of them, careful in the way of people who have known loss and understand what it costs. They were not reckless with each other. What built between them built the way a good fire builds, slow and solid and thorough, starting from honest things and taking hold. He told her about Missouri, about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and his father, who had been a difficult man, hard in the way that the war made some men hard. He told her about the first cattle drive north, when he was 19, and the older cowboy who had looked after him and taught him how to read weather and track water and all the small survival skills of the open country. He told her that he had been lonely for a long time in a way he had not had words for until he stopped being lonely. Alice told him about Kansas, about her childhood there, about the way the horizon went on forever, and the sky was bigger than any sky she had known since. She told him about meeting Thomas, who had been the kind of man who moved through a room like weather, filling it up, and about following him west and about the hard work and the joy of it. She told him about the day of the fever, the morning Thomas had been fine and by afternoon had not been, and the 5 days that followed until the end. She told Peter these things late at night by the fire, telling them fully and without diminishment, because she had decided that whatever this was between them, it was going to be built on real things. He listened the way he always listened, wholly and without interruption, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like someone worth loving," and she said, "He was," and Peter reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that until the fire burned very low. February came and the snow was deep and the cold was serious and the valley was entirely a world unto itself, and Alice did not experience this as imprisonment the way she had feared she might. She found that she had become a different person over these months, or perhaps had become more fully herself. She had found a kind of steadiness in the work and in the days, and in the company of this man who had come into her valley on a rainy October night half frozen and bleeding, and who had turned out to be the kind of person she had not known she was waiting for, but who fit into the life she was building with the ease of something that was always supposed to be there. He was building something too, she began to realize in February. He had not spoken of it directly, but she noticed things. He was spending his evenings, when the day's work was done, sketching on paper. She saw him at it one night when she came to call him for supper and found him at the table in the barn, bent over a piece of paper with a pencil, and she saw the lines before he covered them, the lines of a structure, a building, floor plans and elevations. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He looked at her and did not try to hide the paper. "A house," he said. She came to the table and looked at it. It was detailed and thoughtful, a proper house, larger than the farmhouse they were living in now, with a real second floor and a wide front porch and a good-sized kitchen, and she noticed a room at the back that could be a nursery. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Her heart was doing something large and unruly in her chest. "For who?" she said, though she thought she knew. He looked at her. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you'll have me," he said, "properly." Alice stood very still. The barn was cold and the lantern was warm, and outside the February wind was moving through the valley with authority. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said. "I know it's quick by some measures. I know there's a lot we haven't said out loud yet. But I have spent 4 months in this valley and in this place and beside you, and I am not a man who takes long to know what he knows." He stood up from the table. "I love you, Alice. I have loved you, I think, since about the 3rd week of November, which is when I admitted it to myself and started trying to figure out what to do about it." He stopped. You don't have to answer right now. Alice looked at him. She looked at the drawing on the table. She thought about Thomas, not with guilt but with the full, honest weight of his memory, and she thought about the life he had wanted to build here and the foundation he had laid for it. And she thought about what she had understood all winter, which was that loving Thomas fully and mourning him truly did not mean that her heart was used up. That love was not a finite resource that got spent. She thought about Peter Ramsey crossing the pass north of this valley in the rain with a cut on his head and nowhere in particular to go, and how he had ridden into her valley and asked for the barn and had proceeded to stay and to work, and to give her back the house that Thomas had started, and to give her something else besides, something she had not been looking for but had received anyway. "I don't need until later," she said. "Yes." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed to her and took her face in his hands, those big careful hands, and kissed her with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about anything. And she put her arms around him and held on. And outside the wind moved through the valley and did what the wind does, which is blow wherever it is going, indifferent to everything except its own direction, while inside the warm circle of his arms in the barn on a February night in Colorado. Alice Archer became entirely certain that things were exactly where they were supposed to be. They talked to Reverend Miles in Ridgecrest in early March, when the road opened up enough to make the trip. Reverend Miles was a round, warm-faced man in his 50s who had been performing marriages and funerals and everything in between in this country for 15 years, and who looked at Peter and Alice with the affectionate practicality of a man who had seen many versions of this particular conversation. "You've been living on the same property since October," he said. "He's been in the barn," Alice said. Reverend Miles looked at Peter. "The barn," Peter confirmed. "And you want to be married in the spring. Before the building season starts," Peter said. "I have a project I want to get underway." Reverend Miles smiled at that. He had the smile of a man who understood what a project was in the context of a man in love. "I'll have you down for the 15th of April, he said. They drove back from Ridgecrest in the buckboard in the March wind with the mountains white ahead of them and the road muddy beneath them, and Peter handled the reins and Alice sat beside him with her shoulder against his, and she thought about how strange and full the world was. "I want to write to your family," Peter said, "before the wedding." "There's just my father and my sister," Alice said. "Father is in Lawrence, Kansas. My sister is in St. Louis. They won't be able to come." "I want to write anyway," he said. "It's the right thing to do." She looked at him. "You are relentless about doing the right thing," she said. "It is a habit," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder just for a moment, and he turned his head and pressed a kiss to her hair without breaking his attention on the road, and she felt completely, unremarkably, entirely happy. The spring came the way spring comes to Colorado high country, not all at once but in stages, with the days lengthening and the snow pulling back up the mountain slopes, and the mud season arriving in April with its particular chaos of soft ground and mud-caked everything. And through it all Peter worked. He worked on the house he had designed. He had gone through the winter plan with Alice many times, refining it, making the changes she wanted, and the final design was more hers than his in many ways, with the big south-facing windows she asked for so the morning light would fill the kitchen, and the wide front porch that would look out over the field toward the mountains, and a room upstairs that she had said she wanted for a sewing room, and that they had both known was not actually a sewing room. He broke ground for the new foundation the first week of April, working in the cool mornings with Calhoun the mule to pull the heavy work, and Alice helped when she could and fed him when she couldn't. And Della Patterson drove down from the north twice a week with more frequency and transparency of motive than she had previously admitted to, and brought her nephew with her the second time, a young man named Frank who was strong and willing, and between the three of them, they got the foundation in before the wedding. The wedding was on April 15th, in the small Ridgecrest church, with Reverend Miles and Della Patterson and Della's nephew Frank and the hardware store owner Mr. Connolly and his wife, who had taken a friendly interest in the proceedings, and a couple of other townspeople who had heard and come to wish them well. Alice wore the good blue dress she had made during the winter, sitting by the fire on the evening she had told herself she was just sewing. It had taken her longer than it should have because she had made it with more care than a purely practical garment required, and when Peter saw her in it, he stood at the end of the aisle with his hat in his hands, and his face doing something that she hoped she was the only person who ever saw, that look of a guarded man entirely laid open by something that surprised him. She walked up the aisle of the small church in the April light and stood beside him, and Reverend Miles read the words that made them husband and wife, and when Peter said, "I do," he said it in that direct, certain way he had of saying things he meant completely, and when Alice said it, she meant it with the full weight of everything she was. Della wept with conspicuous satisfaction in the front row. After the ceremony, they went to the restaurant in Ridgecrest for a wedding supper, the whole small party of them, and Mr. Connolly gave a toast that was genuinely affecting, and Della gave one that was affecting and also extremely funny, and Frank got into the whiskey and had to be managed gently by his aunt, and the evening was warm and loud, and full of the kind of generous, uncomplicated happiness that small communities know how to make when the occasion calls for it. On the drive home in the April dark, with the stars clear overhead and the spring smell of the thawing earth in the air, Alice sat close beside Peter and he drove with one arm around her, and they did not talk much, and the valley came up to meet them in the dark like something welcoming them home. He built the house through the spring and into summer. He had made contacts in Ridgecrest and the surrounding country during the winter, quietly, the way he made all his contacts, and he found two reliable hands who wanted work, brothers named Cal and Ephraim Stroud, who were young and strong and good workers. With them he raised the frame in May and got the roof on by June, working long days in the warming weather, and Alice watched the house go up with a feeling she could not have fully described, which was something between the completion of a promise and the beginning of something new. She was pregnant by the time the frame went up. She knew it by the middle of May, and she told Peter on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse watching the new frame against the sunset sky. He turned to look at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was complete, his expression. It left nothing out. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for her hand and held it, and they sat like that looking at the frame of the house he was building, and he said softly, "I'm going to get the roof on faster." She laughed so hard she cried, and he laughed with her, and the evening was warm and the new frame stood clean against the orange sky. He did get the roof on faster. He also added certain things to the house that he had not originally planned: the extra closet off the bedroom, the second fireplace, the wide window seat in what was becoming undeniably a nursery. He added them without making a production of it, the same way he did most things. They moved into the new house in late July, carrying everything from the old farmhouse across the yard in a day's work, with Della and Frank helping and making an occasion of it. The new house was larger and lighter and better in all the ways that planning and care and love make a building better, and it was built to last, in the solid, thorough way of a man who was not building for the short term. The old farmhouse they would use for storage and for the hands during work seasons. Peter had plans for it too, modest improvements to make it more useful, and Alice already knew he would carry them out with the same patient exactness he brought to everything. Della stood in the new kitchen and looked at the south-facing windows and the light they were full of in the morning, and she put her hands on her hips and said, "Thomas would have loved this house." Alice was standing beside Peter when Della said it, and she felt his hand on her back, steady and warm. "Yes," Alice said, "he would have." She had planted a second elm tree that spring, near the first one at the southern edge of the property, and she thought of them as a pair, something she did not need to explain to anyone. The baby came in December, on a cold, clear night very like the night a year earlier when Peter had first kissed her on the porch in the winter air. Della Patterson arrived in the late afternoon with her neighbor Mrs. Holt, who had delivered half the babies in the valley and whose presence was as calming as her skill, and Peter paced the new kitchen with a controlled precision that told Alice, through the long hours of the night, that he was holding himself together through sheer will. Their son was born a little before midnight, strong and loud and red-faced with a full head of dark hair, and when Della brought him out and put him in Peter's arms, Peter stood in the kitchen doorway with the child and looked at Alice through the bedroom door, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it, every line of it undone and remade by something too large for any expression to fully contain. "Hello," he said to the baby very quietly. "I've been waiting for you." Alice, who was exhausted and triumphant and more completely happy than she had known how to imagine, said, "What are we going to call him?" Peter looked at her. "I thought Thomas," he said, "if you want that." She had not expected it, and the unexpected things were the ones that got through. "Thomas Peter Ramsey," she said. He nodded. "Thomas Peter Ramsey," he agreed. Della Patterson, who had been listening from the other side of the room with tears running freely down her face, said that this was the finest naming she had ever witnessed, and that she was going to be a presence in this child's life whether anyone had consulted her or not, and Peter turned to her with the child still in his arms and said, "I was counting on it," and Della dissolved entirely and had to sit down. The winter that followed was the first of many, and they were all different. The first year with Thomas in the house was the one that remade everything. The baby grew with the particular speed of babies in good hands, and the valley changed around the growing season, and Peter Ramsey, who had come through this country on a wet October night looking for shelter and found more than shelter, found himself a man who had arrived somewhere. He could mark it, the arriving. It had not been a single moment but a series of them. The first morning hearing the barn work from the kitchen window, the first night eating soup with a woman who was honest enough to keep a gun on the table and kind enough to feed him anyway. The first time he held her hand in the candlelight of the new parlor. The evening in February in the barn with the drawing on the table and everything uncertain. The morning she said yes. He had not known, at 17 or 25 or 29, that a man could ride into a valley and find what was missing in his life, not know it was missing, then find it present everywhere. He had not known that home was something that could happen to you by accident, that it could begin as a barn on a rainy night and become something as solid and real as the house he had built with his own hands. Alice, in the spring of their second year together, was in the garden when he came to find her, Thomas on his hip, the boy 18 months old and interested in everything. She was on her knees in the kitchen garden pulling the first weeds of the season, and she looked up at the two of them standing at the edge of the garden in the afternoon sun, and felt the fullness of the life they had made as something almost physical, something you could put your hand on. "There's a letter from your father," Peter said, and handed her the envelope. She read it there in the garden, with Thomas investigating the fence post beside her and Peter reading over her shoulder without apology. Her father wrote that he was old and not as well as he had been, and that he had been thinking about making the trip west if the rail connection was what he had heard, and if his daughter and her husband would have him for a season. "Write back today," Peter said before she could say anything. "Tell him to come." Alice looked up at him. "Your father should know where you are," he said simply, "and Thomas should know his grandfather." She folded the letter and stood up from the garden, brushing the dirt from her knees, and she stood in front of her husband in the afternoon light with her son on his hip and her garden growing behind her and the house he had built visible over his shoulder, and she thought that she had not known, when she came to this valley with Thomas Archer in the spring of 1872, that the ground they were standing on would hold so much. "You are," she said to Peter, "the most decent man I have ever known." He looked at her with the slight surprise he still sometimes showed when she said something direct and good, as though part of him had not entirely finished being astonished that this was his life. "You had good material to work with," he said. She took his face in her hands, the way he sometimes took hers, and kissed him there in the garden in the afternoon with the baby watching with great interest, and Peter kissed her back with the warmth and the care that he put into everything he loved. Her father came in September. He was thinner than she remembered and walked with the limp he had brought home from Virginia 9 years ago, but his eyes were clear, and he embraced her at the station in Ridgecrest with a strength that surprised her, and he shook Peter Ramsey's hand and looked at him for a long moment with the assessing look of a father who had thought about this meeting and decided what he needed to know. "She wrote that you built the house yourself," he said. "Most of it," Peter said. "She helped with the decisions that matter." Her father looked at Alice, then back at Peter. "Good answer," he said, and that was that. Her father spent 6 weeks with them. He sat on the wide front porch in the October sunshine and held Thomas on his knee and told the boy stories about Kansas and about Alice's mother, who had been dead for 7 years and whom Alice found she wanted her son to know, even in this small proxy way. He played chess with Peter in the evenings, and they argued about politics and the direction of the country, with the particular comfortable heat of two principled men who respect each other. And Alice sat nearby and listened and felt the layering of her life, the past and the present sitting in the same room, not in opposition but in conversation. When her father left in October, he embraced Peter at the station with the same strength he had used on Alice, and Peter received it in the way he received all genuine things, with steadiness and no performance. "Take care of her," her father said. "I will," Peter said. "I know you will," her father said. "That's why I can go home." Alice watched the train pull out of the Ridgecrest station until it was a small dark shape and then nothing against the wide Colorado sky, and Peter stood beside her with Thomas on his hip, and she slipped her hand into his arm. "He likes you," she said. "I like him," Peter said. "He'll come back," she said. "I know," Peter said. "I already invited him for spring." She looked up at him. "I told him the garden will need all the experienced opinion it can get," Peter said, straight-faced. Alice laughed and tucked herself more firmly into his arm, and they walked back to the buckboard in the October afternoon, under a sky that was the particular deep, impossible blue that Colorado makes in autumn, and drove home through the valley that was, in every sense of the word that had ever mattered, theirs. The years that laid themselves down after that one were good years, not unmarked by difficulty, because the West was not a soft country and the work of a farm and a ranch is not a soft work, and they had their hard seasons and their lean ones, their losses large and small in the way of lives lived fully in the world. The winter of 1877 brought disease through the cattle in the valley and they lost 7 head, which was a real blow. In 1878, a late frost destroyed most of the kitchen garden and Alice had a pregnancy that ended too early, in March, and they were quiet with each other for a time afterward in the particular tender way of people sharing a grief they cannot fix. But Peter Ramsey had built a good house and a good fence and a good barn, and he and Alice Archer had built a good life, and the ground they stood on was solid and real and entirely their own. Their second son, James, was born in November of 1878, healthy and loud and with his mother's green eyes, which Peter noticed with an expression of unashamed delight. Their daughter Eleanor came in 1880, with her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn set of the jaw, which Della Patterson declared at first viewing to be the most promising combination she had ever observed. Della Patterson was Eleanor's godmother, and she took the role with the seriousness of a calling. She came to the Ramsey farm regularly and often, and was entirely at home in the house that Peter had built, and she and Peter had developed over the years a relationship of mutual deep respect expressed almost entirely through the good-natured trading of pointed remarks, which Alice found endlessly entertaining. "That woman is a force of nature," Peter said one evening after a particularly vigorous Della visit. "She was right about everything from the beginning," Alice pointed out. She was right about the shingles, Peter said. Everything else is debatable. Peter Ramsey, Alice said. She told me in November of 1873 that you were a man worth keeping. He looked at her. She said that. In slightly different language, Alice said, but yes. He was quiet for a moment. She's a perceptive woman, he said. Alice looked at him across the kitchen table where they had eaten 1,000 suppers, in the house he had built before the spring of 1874, in the valley she had held through that first hard winter alone, and that she had never been alone in since. She is, Alice said. She was right. Thomas, their oldest, was 8 years old in the spring of 1882, and he had his grandfather's name and his father's steadiness, and his mother's way of looking at things, which was directly and without pretense. He was already following Peter around the property with the interested seriousness of a boy who wants to understand how things work, and Peter taught him with the patience he brought to all teaching, which was considerable. Alice watched them one morning from the porch. Peter crouched beside Thomas at the fence line, showing him how to read whether a post was set true, the two of them in the same posture, heads bent at the same angle, and she felt the kind of happiness that is so complete and quiet it barely announces itself. She was 37 years old, and she was not done, she thought. There was more to come. More seasons and more mornings, and more of the particular texture of this life she had built in this valley. The children would grow, and the farm would grow, and the country around them would change, as it was already changing, as it always did, the frontier drawing back and civilization pressing forward in all its complicated mixed blessing of a way. The railroad would come closer, and the towns would grow, and the wildness of the country would be negotiated with and altered, and none of that was simple or without cost. But the house was solid. The barn was tight. The fence ran true all the way around the south field. The elm trees at the edge of the property stood side by side, the old one and the new one, their canopies beginning to touch in the spring. And Peter Ramsey, who had ridden into her valley on a wet October night in 1873 looking for nothing more than shelter from the weather, came in from the field at midday and found his wife on the porch with a leaner on her hip and James running circles in the yard and Thomas sitting on the fence watching the mountains. And he stopped at the gate and looked at the whole of it with the expression she loved most in him, the one that was not performing anything. That was just a man looking at his life with full knowledge of what it was worth. He came through the gate and up the porch steps and kissed her, and Alina grabbed his hat and he let her have it, and Alice laughed against his mouth and he laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the yard and the field and the valley that held them all. "Dinner is ready," Alice said. "Good," he said. "I'm hungry." "You are always hungry," she said. "You are always a good cook," he said. They went inside, the whole of them, into the house he had built for her before the spring. The valley held them. The mountains stood around them. The sky above Colorado was wide and blue and indifferent to small things, which was how it had always been and how it would always be. And underneath that great indifferent sky, in the house with the south-facing windows and the wide front porch and the two elm trees growing toward each other at the southern edge of the property, the Ramsey family sat down to dinner. And the day was good, and the years ahead were full, and everything that mattered was in that room.